Hello, this is Dr. Lori. Welcome to this video on real-world tables. We're going to be taking a look at a couple of tables that are examples of some good things and some things that could possibly be improved. But the general idea that I want you to keep in mind as we're talking about tables is that really this is for the same purpose as when we were looking at graphs, to convert data, which are all those individual values, those data points, into a more structured information that can be used by stakeholders. So here's our stakeholders to make decisions, because ultimately that's we're compiling a lot of data into a smaller amount of information to convey a picture. So let's take a look at this article. And the only reason that I gave you the whole article, and it's attached in our class as well, is so that you could see the table in context. I could have cut and pasted it, just the table, but I wanted you to see what this looks like when it's part of something. So do not feel compelled to read the article. There will be no test over it. This really is just so that you can see the table in context. So here's table 1 in this particular article. The title just simply says Sample Characteristics, n equals 1,244. And then as we go through the table, you can see that the different variables are grouped. So the first three, sex, age, and race, have to do with the characteristics of the adolescent in the study. And then the next two, sex and educational attainment, have to do with the parent characteristics, so you're already starting to get an idea of what this table is about. And then finally there's a third section, household characteristics, and that has annual income and region. And you could read more if you wanted to in the methods section. A lot of times they talk about how they decided on different characteristics or how they're defined. Maybe you're not exactly sure what North, East, Midwest, South, and West include, which states, and so they may specify that at some location elsewhere in the article. But the general idea here is that they're giving us a picture, they're painting a picture about the group that is being studied. And so here we have all of these different variables, and the thing that I'd like to point out in the footnote says, note, table shows raw frequencies and weighted percentages. So they've helped you out to know exactly what the numbers mean. At the top of the right-hand column it says N, and then in parentheses it says percent. The percent is in parentheses all the way down. And this is going to be really, really key for you when you're making tables, is that you want it to look something like this. The reason so many tables look this way is that it's very easy to follow. So for example, at the very top it says sex, male, female. It might be hard for somebody looking at just 653 and 591 to say, well, you know, that's close to half, but how close? So the percent in the bracket 53 and 47 really helps draw a person's attention to those numbers by having it in brackets. Not a separate column, not just two numbers side by side, but in brackets really is very helpful in terms of discerning between the different pieces of information in the table. If that categorical variable has more than two categories, then it just has more listings. And there are a couple things that I'd like to point out on here, is that as we go down the hierarchy of information, things become indented more and more. So adolescent characteristics is flush with the very left side of the table. Sex is indented 1, and then male and female are indented 2. Age is indented only 1, but then the different age categories, 11 and 12, 13, 14, 15, and then 16 and 17 are indented farther. The other thing I'd like to highlight specifically with this table is that that you see the different rows. Every other row has shading versus not shading, shading versus not shading, and that helps you track across to be able to see what statistics go with that particular category, especially if it's a long distance across. Every journal has its own style, so this journal tends to have this kind of a style, the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. So you'll notice different things. Also, the other thing that I wanted to point out is specifically in this one the way they tended to group them. And so the adolescent characteristics are all grouped together, the parent characteristics are grouped together, and the household characteristics are grouped together. So those are some features about this particular table that are really helpful to make it easy for the reader to gather the information out of the table. Let's take a look at the second table. And this is slightly different. This one has a more complete title. It says characteristics of eligible women invited to participate in the National Diabetes Prevention Program. And so that tells you a little bit more about the who. Sometimes the title of a table, depending on the journal, of course, and different other reasons, sometimes the title of the table will also include the when and where. So it might have the years of the study, it might have the location, might be all of the US, or it might be in Chicago, it might be in a specific location or a specific time frame. And so sometimes the title of the table will include that as well. Both of these titles included the sample size, and they don't always. So there are just a variety of different features. Also notice the little superscript A at the end of the title. If you look at the footnote, then it says data are presented as capital M and then parentheses SD. That means mean and standard deviation for continuous variables, and frequency, and in parentheses percent, for categorical variables. So it depends what kind of variable it is. The footnote tells you. Now, in the future, I'll show you some examples where the data are presented as mean and standard error. And that's a different kind of information. And so it really is good to specify if you're using mean and standard deviation versus mean and standard error, or even median and some other kind of information. Then you'll notice on the left-hand side, you'll see characteristics, and the same kind of thing happens with the indentations. Age, there are two separate categories that are mutually exclusive and contain everybody in the study. Either they were age 18 to 39 or age 40 and over. And if you add those two numbers together, 1660 plus 3206, you should get 4866. And then the percentages are there on the right hand side. They've done an interesting thing with this particular variable where the age, if you follow that shaded row across, it says 46.8 and parentheses 14.0. They've given both the N and percent for the categories and the mean and standard deviation as if it's just a continuous variable. And so you get both things. I think most people would say that it would be a good idea to put age and then in parentheses years, just because then that's clearer, because age can be other things. Usually in adults it is years, and so that may be considered redundant for a specific journal. Under race ethnicity, you can see the different groups. Here's an interesting one, preferred Spanish language class. So 26.5% of women preferred the Spanish language class. Sometimes we have to presume that the remaining percentage did not prefer the Spanish language class. So if we have a dichotomous variable, sometimes they'll only list one of the categories, just to kind of give a sense rather than having 3 rows to represent all of that information. And then qualification status is categorical. The numbers represented there are frequencies and percents. And then the baseline BMI, it goes back to a mean and a standard deviation. So those are some features of the table. There are a couple of other things that I would like to point out specifically in this one. You'll notice the left column is left justified up against the left side of the table. That's very common with the indentations being very consistent. But the right-hand column is centered. Outreached and women, and then all of the numbers and percentages are centered within that column. And you'll notice there is no line separating the left column from the right column. That's also pretty typical. So we don't necessarily have to have all of the lines in a table to be included. So just pay attention to certain things that to you really help you to kind of gather the information out of the table more easily. And those would be the same kinds of things that would help somebody else. The final thing I'd like to point out in this particular table is how many decimal places they've included. For the frequencies, those are just counts, and so they have no decimal places. You would not say women aged 18 to 39 years is 1660.0. You would not include a decimal point. But when they've included the 34.1%, they've gone to the tenths. They've included one decimal place, and that's pretty typical for percentages. Also, for any continuous variable, in this case the age and the baseline BMI, you'll notice that for both the mean and the standard deviation, they've included one decimal place. And so for age, you have 46.8 as a mean and 14.0 as the standard deviation. Even though it's a 0, they still include the decimal place. And for baseline BMI, 34.4 as the mean BMI and 7.6 as the standard deviation for that. And so typically, when we measure things like age, we'll include one more decimal place than the level of measurement. So if they measured age in years, then we'll go one more decimal place. I would imagine that BMI was calculated out farther than one decimal place, but they probably collected weight in either kilograms or pounds and height in either inches or centimeters, and they may not have included decimal places, and so that way they're in the BMI, they're including one more decimal place than they collected. So those are a few of the kinds of things that I'd like to point out. So let's go ahead and go back to our tables. So one of the things that I like to point out is that the table should really be able to stand alone. What that means is that you need to have any information about the title and footnotes that would help you interpret the table, even if you didn't have the article with it. And so ideally, those titles would have been a little more expanded. They would have included person, place, and time information. And any abbreviations need to be in the footnotes. You need to specify if it's mean and standard deviation or frequency and percent. Those kinds of things are very important so that if you look at the table, you can gather the information. The second thing is to keep it simple. We really want this to look clean, not cluttered. We don't want to be adding all kinds of fluffy information or changing the font style or making it just difficult to look at. And so keeping it nice and simple and clean, that really kind of ties in with the aesthetics. Aesthetics has several different pieces. First of all, the font should be very straightforward. Don't do a lot of crazy things with italics and bold and that kind of thing. Keep it pretty simple. The other thing is position. I pointed out that the left column that lists the different variable types generally is left justified with indentations, and that the right column is generally centered, and then those parentheses are really key to help somebody really be able to glean the information. And then a couple of other things are the whole idea with color and shading, and the lines. So you noticed on that particular style, they shaded every other row so that you could follow them across. Some use a darker color of either shading or color in the header row. These did not. But often the shading takes the place of the lines. So instead of just having boxes, the standard table, then we try to make it a little bit more aesthetic and easy to follow. Number 4 seems obvious, but this has to do with making sure that these are the correct stats for that particular variable type. So if you have a variable that's continuous, the mean and standard deviation would really be the best to use in most situations. If it's categorical, then you would want to use the frequency and percent. Then if you have that interesting in between, you would use median and either range or interquartile range, whatever the standard is for that particular topic. Number 5 really has to do with categorical variables. And if those are ordinal, it would be important to keep them in order. And I'll show you some examples of what not to do in the next video. But just that idea of people's brains kind of follow that particular order. And so to put them in a funny, out of order sequence makes it really difficult to gather that information out of the table. And then if it's nominal, there's no hard and fast rule about that. You could put them in order alphabetically. That's perfectly acceptable. Very often I see those variables in order from most frequent to least frequent. And so there are a couple of options. So alphabetical versus category size, like the greatest to smallest. But whatever it is that you're doing, try to keep it consistent and make sure that it seems logical for that particular variable. And then the final thing is about decimal points. Usually we go to the 10th. Very often for a lot of different things. In general, if we measure something in units, then we use one more decimal place. Like a scale variable, we use one more decimal place, and the percentages for categorical variables, we generally go to the 10th. So those are some important things to think about when we're looking at actual tables. In our next video, we'll talk about some of the exceptions and what kinds of things can go wrong when we're looking at tables.